First up, we have Professor Wang Zhixi, an associate professor of comparative literature at Shantou University, and he has a joint appointment in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature and the Center for Religious Culture Studies. So next up, we have Dr. John Lindblum. He has his PhD in theology, world religion, world church from the University of Notre Dame. His presentation is called A Chinese Tunic for Christ, an introduction to John C.H. Wu's classical Chinese Bible translation. Our final presenter is Kathy Stout. She has just finished her third year as a doctoral student in the Department of Religious Studies at University of Dayton. Her presentation is called Thomas Merton and Interreligious Dialogue.
Dear colleagues, greetings from Hong Kong. My name is Jordan Zhixi. I go by Zhixi or Jordan. It's my pleasure to be presenting at this conference hosted by the US-China Catholic Association. I would like, first of all, to draw your attention to the gist of my presentation by having changed my main title from Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism as my teachers to Faith Seeking Comparing to appropriate St. Anselm of Canterbury's famous motto, as you may have very well guessed. I will illustrate this idea as the presentation goes. While much of Western scholarship on comparative theology tends to explore in an exclusively academic manner the relationship of Christianity to other religions, the reflection upon and articulation of this relationship is as much a personally intellectual negotiation as it is a scholarly enterprise, especially for those local converts to Christianity who used to immerse themselves within other religious traditions. And previous scholarship on comparative theology has not done justice to the significant contributions from the Global South, given the fact that, more often than not, only Western theologians like Karl Rahner are predominantly made reference to. A case regarding the interreligious theological discourse from the Global South in both personal and academic manners can be found in the autobiography of a Chinese Catholic intellectual named John C.H. Wu, Wu Jingxiong, who was born in 1899, the year preceding the outbreak of the Boxer Uprising in China, and died at the age of 87 in 1986. Originally published in 1951, 14 years after his conversion to Catholicism, and recently republished by University of Notre Dame Press in 2018, Wu's autobiography Beyond East and West, hereafter BEW, can be appreciated as the Chinese Augustinian Confessions. It's a full-length reflection upon his spiritual odyssey from a Chinese to a Chinese Protestant Methodist as a young adult before finally turning to the Christian Catholic faith 2 decades later in his middle age. Wu's BEW may be considered quite unique, not only in terms of the English language used by Wu as the medium of writing, but also the multiple identities that he occupies. The University of Michigan Law School graduate, professor of law, judge, lawyer, first drafter of a new constitution for the Republic of China, scholar of jurisprudence, Chinese philosophy, literature, and religious studies, ambassador from the Republic of China to the Vatican, friend of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Oriental mentor to Thomas Merton, and the father of 13 children. One of the most noticeable features in Wu's BEW is his discursive negotiation between his adopted faith and China's religions in whose milieu he was born. In BEW, again and again, Wu expressed his gratitude for being born into China because Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Buddha were called his pedagogues or tutors to lead him to Christ. Wu also likens himself to be a Maitian Magus from China, who lays before the divine infant in the arms of the Blessed Virgin, the gold of Confucianism, the musk of Taoism, and the frank incense of Buddhism. So how does Wu in BW make sense of statements like these through his comparative theological engagement? I argue in this presentation that the threefold discursive strategies Wu employs in BW to make sense of his faith-seeking comparing involve in an affirmative and predominant manner the experientially typological interpretation, the moral figure parallel, and the didactic analogy. In the following presentation, I'll provide a limited number of samples illustrating each of these three strategies before concluding by succinctly theorizing Wu's case in relation to the discussion within the mainstream comparative theology scholarship. Now, the experientially typological interpretation, Wu's first discursive strategy to bridge the epistemological gap between Christianity and China's religions, is more personal than the next two strategies. It concerns what China's religions have taught Wu personally in preparation for him to finally embrace the Christian faith. While typological interpretation in biblical studies originally means interpreting a thing or event in the light of a foreshadowing type, as when baptism is illustrated by reference to Noah's flood, I appropriate it to refer to the hermeneutical lens from which Wu approaches the significant persons of China's religious influences on his life as types, prefiguring Catholic antitypes. Let me give you two examples, one about Confucianism and another Buddhism. First, Wu had a father who is not a Christian, but whose life motto is help others even when you have not enough to spare. His non-Christian father's Confucian cultivation of love for others reminds Wu of two biblical proof texts that, in Wu's interpretation, imply the possibility of the existence of what would be called by Karl Rahner anonymous Christians. The first text is taken from James 1, religion clean and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their tribulation, and to keep one's self unspotted from this world. Another is what St. Peter said in the house of Cornelius in Acts 10. In very deed, I perceive that God is not a respecter of persons, but in every nation, he that feared him and worked justice is acceptable to him. Wu thus argues that my father is a Catholic, a citizen of the spiritual Jerusalem. Another quick example comes from the influence of Mahayana Buddhism on Wu. The popular sutra called the Sutra of the Kernel of Transcendental Wisdom that Wu had known from his childhood conveyed some vague idea of the unreality and transiency of life in this world, and invoked a nameless longing for the other shore. And this Buddhist other shore, now for Wu the Catholic, is but another name and the faint foreshadowing of the kingdom of God, which is within us. This is what I call experientially typological interpretation. The second discursive strategy, the moral figure parallel, employed by Wu, refers to the ways in which well-known moral figures in Chinese religious traditions are compared to Christian saints. Let me just share one example. One of the Confucian moral figures that Wu introduces is someone named Ming Zijian, who is one of the 10 most prominent students under Confucius. Famous for his virtue, Ming's virtuous story as follows impresses Wu most. A child who lost his mother, Ming was mistreated by his stepmother, who clothed Ming in winter with garments made of rushes but gave her own 2 sons warm cotton clothes. While later on, Ming's father found out his wife's cruel and partial treatment, and thus felt so angry as to determine to divorce her. Ming pleaded with success, saying, "If mother remains, only 1 son is cold. If mother goes away, 3 sons will be destitute." Wu then underlines that Ming's generosity and wisdom reminds Wu himself of Christian saints. Ethically speaking, for Wu, some of the Confucian and Christian saints are much alike, despite their distinct religious belongings. Didactic analogy is the last discursive strategy Wu resorts to when he seeks didactic understanding and commonalities between Christianity and Chinese religions. In terms of Confucian-Christian synthesis, 2 conventional themes claimed by Wu are in line with the long tradition of the Mingqing Catholicism. Number 1, Confucius' belief in a personal heaven who has will, intelligence, creative power, and protective love, and thus is but another name for God. And number 2, the transfer of human filial piety into the divine realm. Apart from them, Mencius' teachings are likened by Wu to those of Christianity. What impressed Wu most about Mencius concerns the latter's philosophy of suffering, a philosophy that keeps one humble in prosperity and hopeful in adversity, and thus cannot be very far from the spirit of Christianity. And Mencius' teaching on the retainment of an innocent heart reminds Wu of Jesus' similar teachings about changing and becoming like children. As to Taoist Christian synthesis, I argue that Wu suggests implicitly the equation of the Chinese Tao, who is at once transcendent and immanent, with the Christian God, who is immanent in nature and transcendent beyond nature as well. This argument is also evidenced by another occasion in BW, where immediately after claiming the unnameable nature of the Tao, Wu quoted from French Catholic novelist Léon Bloy as follows to support the preceding claim. When one speaks lovingly of God, all human words are like so many blind lions seeking a spring in the desert. Paradoxical philosophy constitutes another area where Wu associates Taoism with Christian mysticism, and this will be my last sample. Admitting his own mystical tendencies, Wu was attracted by Lao Tzu and the Christian mystics' paradoxical ways of thinking. Once when he read William James' quotations from St. John of the Cross, such as "to possess all things, resolve to possess nothing, and to be all things, be willing to be nothing," Wu cannot help but analogize these sayings to the Taoist teaching. I underlined them and added the word on the margin, Taoistic, Wu said. In conclusion, Wu in BEW mainly focuses on similarities or analogies instead of differences between Christianity and China's religions. Teleologically speaking, Wu aims to overcome the Oriental religious otherness for global Catholic community in the mid-20th century. Theoretically speaking, his case is a fascinating one that challenges the conventional paradigms, such as the dichotomy of pluralism and inclusivism in the studies of comparative theology and theology of religions. Like the pluralist theologian, who identifies with more than one religion, 4 actually. But at the same time, also like the inclusivist theologian, he will not accept the premise of the pluralist model, that is, the equivalence of all religions in matters of truth. In his approach to the question of religious truth, Wu still persists like an inclusivist who recognizes the possible presence of truth in other religions, insofar as it may be reconciled with the truth of one's own religion. Wu comfortably belongs to the group of conventional comparative theologians, since he accesses Chinese religious traditions from a Catholic normative position. But also like a post-colonial theologian who takes seriously the reality of hybrid religious identities as resource for theological reflection. And his own life story is one deconstructing dichotomous typifications between religious traditions. In the final analysis, Wu's is a faith-seeking comparing. Comparing constitutes an essential way for Wu's faith-seeking and consolidating. Accordingly, Beyond East and West should be appreciated as one of the important comparative theological texts in 20th century, and John C.H. Wu as one of the early pioneers, like German theologian Karl Rahner, of comparative theology. Wu should be taken into more serious consideration by the emerging comparative theological scholarship, and his autobiography should be more widely adopted for class discussion by those courses dealing with interreligious theological engagement. Thank you.
I would like to start by asking two questions. If you were a young and respected intellectual in China in the late 1930s, raised with deep love for classical poetry and literature, and had recently undergone a dramatic conversion to Christianity, like we just heard about, like St. Augustine, after years in spiritual and emotional misery due to your own life of pride and falling into a dissolute lifestyle, and you wanted to read and enjoy the Psalms and other parts of the Bible in a form that you loved to hear, but no such version existed, what would you do? Question 2. If you were the president of China and a baptized Christian, married to a devout Christian wife, and wanted to make the Christian Bible, well, first you wanted to also read the Bible according to a traditional Chinese cultural forms that were deeply rooted in your heart, and you wanted to make the Christian Bible, and through it, Christianity itself, as attractive as possible to the people of a culture such as China's, with thousands of years of rich humanistic writing in literature, philosophy, and spirituality. How would you do it? Perhaps the most common method throughout the history of Christianity by missionaries has been to translate the Bible into local languages, adhering as closely as possible to the original Hebrew and Greek words. But in that effort, what is lost? Or do you create a work that sounds so foreign to the audience that you're trying to reach that it's not very accessible or not very appealing? So these two questions came together when John C.H. Wu, after his conversion, he wanted to read the Book of Psalms, which he loved very deeply, but he wanted to read them in Chinese, in a way that spoke to him at the emotional level in his heart. And so he began to translate the Psalms into classical Chinese poems, following the models of his favorite, which was Tang Dynasty poetry. And this was in around 1940. And at that time, he was acquainted with the Song sisters, the famous Song sisters, and he gave, you'll see in a second, Song Meiling, the youngest, was married to Chiang Kai-shek, president of China. But Wu first showed his translations to another sister, and she showed it to Song Meiling, and she showed it to Chiang Kai-shek, and they liked it, and so they became acquainted with John Wu, got to know him, and then, now hold that thought for a second. Some of you may have been to Spain and seen the Basilica of the Sagrada Familia, or you're familiar with it. What the architect Gaudí took a traditional art form and reinvigorated it in new ways. I'm just going to very quickly show you some things he did. He made the outside look like a melting Easter cake, somebody called it once. They were insulting it. Inside, spectacular light fills the basilica. That's the looking up at the roof. All these figures on the outside. It's a traditional form. It's a basilica. It's traditional architecture, but he's doing completely new things with it. He adds pelicans, snails, lizards, frogs, and turtles, ladybugs, and flowers that were in the fields near where he grew up. A Chinese artist named He Qi took the wedding feast at Cana and put it into Chinese folk art styles. And he did this with St. Paul, the calling of St. Paul, as a opera figure. So John C.H. Wu did, I argue, something similar with the Psalms and the New Testament. So now back to Song and Chiang Kai-shek. She wrote him a letter and she said, all the translations that exist, they're so bad, but the truth still comes through the bad translations. How much more powerful the Bible would be if a really clear and readable translation could be had. Now, it's a fascinating question because there were already many translations of the Bible in existence at the time, but they still felt that none of them was good enough. Chiang Kai-shek paid John Wu to do the translation, and he would sometimes visit Jiang. And so here's Jiang holding a copy of one of the early drafts of the translation. So I want to get into some of the features, the special features, and let you see some of the text itself. So we'll go through four main features today. The first is an elevated poetic classical style, and these examples will combine a number of these features. Terms borrowed from the Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist classics. Like you just heard in the last presentation, Wu embraced all three of the Sanjiao, these three traditions, and incorporated their terms and their ideas freely and enthusiastically into his Bible translation. So starting with the most famous part is the prologue of John's Gospel. And Wu renders this, there are many different ways, and it presents lots of problems. The first big problem for Bible translation in many languages is how to translate the Greek word logos. In the beginning was the logos. Wu chooses Tao, and there's been arguments for over a century over whether Tao is the right Chinese word to use. But Wu went with Tao, and he even elaborated and deepened the understanding of what he meant by Tao. So he translates it as 太初有道，与天俱协，道即天主。自始与邪，微道无物，物因道生，天地万有，自道已成. And we could spend an entire week going through all of the cultural implications of just the prologue. And I want to skip ahead because there's a lot more to share, but he continues with this four-character poetic style. Actually, at first he did it into five-character poetry, and then Chiang Kai-shek told him to put it into four-character poetry. Now, when you get to kind of the key conclusion to the prologue, a lot of this is a prose version, and it's just very matter-of-fact and straightforward. So, 道成了肉身，就在我们中间，充充满满的有恩典的真理. So it's just very straightforwardly explaining. John Wu put this into wonderful poetry. John Wu's version, 道成人身，至我柴中。五柴清笃孔德之容，唯一圣子无上光荣，妙穷真谛，崇义结功. Yeah. And so, just in this little passage, he borrows from numerous traditions. He incorporates the poetry styles of the Tang Dynasty. So he continues with Tao, coming from Taoism, and then in green, 孔德之容. He uses that as one of the translations for glory. That 孔德之容 is a line directly from the Tao Te Ching. And then 妙穷真谛. 真谛in yellow there. 真谛 is a term most associated with Buddhism, and it means the ultimate truth. It's the truth that is not apparent to everybody on the surface. It's the deepest truth about God or about the depths of the heart. And so in the previous example, they used 真理, which is the more common word for truth in everyday life, but Wu chooses the Buddhist term, 真谛. it's suitable for singing. And I want to play a short video. So many parts of the Wu version are said to be melodious to the ear and suitable for singing. And this song is composed by a current Catholic songwriter in Taiwan, Hu Mingjie, and he has several videos. You can look him up on YouTube, and he has put a number of John Wu's psalms into songs. Are you keeping time, Stephanie? How much time I have left?
We've got about 12 minutes left.
Okay.
太初有道，与天主显，道即天主，自始于显。太初有道，与天主显，道即天主，自始于显。
So you can see he did a really nice job with John Wu's lyrics there. And I just wrote to Hu Mingjie and just got some things back from him. So I was asking him questions about why did you choose Wu's version, and he wrote back some nice answers, but I don't have time to share it all right now. Okay, and so the next feature I want to point out is parallelism. Now, Chinese poetry, as you know, and lots of other things are filled with parallelism, and Wu does a beautiful job, especially with the Psalms. His Psalm 23 is one of the favorites of all of his Psalm translations. But here's another example I want to... I need to get back here. Back to the... Good, okay. So from Psalm 36, Wu has 主之慈爱冲诸天，主之信义播云间，主之正直峻于月，主之锐断生于渊. So, if you know much about Chinese poetry, which I don't, you can point out numerous features here. But he puts in this type of construction, it's 7-character poetry with 4 characters grouped at the front of the line, 3 characters grouped at the end, and the first 4, obviously, it's 主之 something something. Something of the Lord is this, and something of the Lord is this. I want to point out my favorite part here, 锐断. Rui, this character means perspicacious or far-sighted and wise. And I combined it with a second character, Un, for grace, that occurs many places throughout the Psalms. And so my wife and I had a baby girl about just under 2 years ago, and we combined that, and we made her Chinese name Rui Un. So this is the fun slide, and this is her baptism dress. And there we are, a couple months ago, just graduated from Notre Dame together. So borrowed from Wu for that. So here's the rest of Psalm 36, but we won't go through that today. But you can get it and look it up. All these texts are online. One place there online, which is easy to find, is called Jesus Taiwan. That's the name of the website, jesus.tw. And there are other places. But unfortunately, the New Testament is not in print. The Psalms is in print in Taiwan, but you have to order it through Taiwan. Use of 4-character phrases, or chengyu. John Wu uses over 300 chengyu in his New Testament translation. That's 6 times more than any other version has ever used. And a scholar named T.S. Foley put together a list of all 306 of them or so. Here's one of the most significant examples is from the Analects of Confucius, 从心所欲. So I won't read the top part, the top Chinese part, except 其实而从心所欲, At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing the norm. And so some of you are very familiar with this. It's a very famous passage from Confucius. The progress in, setting your heart upon learning and then growing in virtue, and then finally by age 70, your heart is aligned with the will of heaven. John Wu uses 从心所欲 six times in the New Testament, and some of those uses are when Jesus is talking about his Father's will and his own will being the same, and the other uses are when other people, other believers, have their wills aligned with God's will. And so he does that in John 5:21. As the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. Another set of 4-character phrases that's quite remarkable is these two. They come from the Shangshu, from the Book of History, but they also appear on the famous Nestorian stele of the early Tang Dynasty first Christian mission to China. Some of you are familiar with that historically. And so the second one I'll look at here is Shu Ji Xian Xi, which is translated as all sorts of works undertaken by the people flourished throughout the land. And Wu uses that to translate this in Acts 24:2 when St. Paul is wanting to flatter or to appeal to Tertullus, a ruler, and said, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since your provision, most excellent Felix, reforms are introduced on behalf of this nation. Thank you. I think this ruler was appealing to the higher ruler, Felix, but he's using this as a form of flattery. In any case, many rich, interesting examples of the Chengyu used throughout John Wu's New Testament, very similar to this. Many borrowed from the Confucian Analects, many borrowed from the Tao Te Ching, some from the I Ching, lots of other sources. Authoritative speech. As I was reading this, I noticed that he often has the words of Jesus coming out in 4-character phrases. And a scholar named Robin McNeil from Cornell came and gave a presentation showing that in ancient dialogues, often a wise ruler would give his instructions or his pronouncements in 4-character phrases like this one. The Grand Duke was asked, how do you take care of the people? And he answers, 利而勿害, 生而勿败, 生而勿杀, 予而勿夺, 离而勿鼓, 喜而勿怒. So the 4-character phrase carries this weight of authority and wisdom. And so John Wu has Jesus often speaking in 4-character phrases similar to these. The second one, 子如母也, this is your mother. I love this bottom one. It's from John Wu's favorite passage in the Bible. 不往周右, 当有所获. Cast your net on the right side of the boat and you will have a catch. Many other examples. So when he's talking about John chapter 6:52, the one who eats this bread will gain eternal life, he puts it in, part of it's in 4-character phrases, part of it's the last part's in 4-character phrases. So if you eat my body, you will have eternal life. Hymnic characteristics is the last feature in this. A scholar named Francis K.H. So highlights the Beatitudes John Wu puts into 7-character poetry. He puts the Magnificat of Mary into 5-character poetry. I'll just read a couple of lines. 五魂红天主，忠心不胜喜，感和救主恩，眷顾及见必。And they all rhyme, so he uses rhyming every line, the cadence of classical poetry. So here are a couple of my thoughts as I was thinking about the enduring value and the aims that Wu was trying to get at. The classical Chinese style carries a timeless beauty which still attracts new generations. It aims not only to baptize but to preserve traditional Chinese culture. The universal God who created all humanity and became incarnate in Jesus Christ is already present in the truth and wisdom of China's humanistic tradition. That builds on the last presentation you just heard. And John Wu wrote a lot about this, both in Beyond East and West that you heard about, and another book of his essays, which has also recently been republished, called Chinese Humanism and Christian Spirituality. So I highly recommend both of those books. Father Matthias Christian was a scholar who just passed away last year and a dear friend, and I think he wrote the first dissertation on John Woo in the 1980s. And he used to always say, John Woo is a man of the future. So the question I want to conclude with is, how might John Woo be a man of the future? What might be the value of his translation or a translation like his to draw from Chinese traditions for evangelistic work in China today, deepening and developing the faith of Christians, preserving traditional Chinese culture? Is that possible through a work such as this? Or other contributions? So I would very much like to hear your thoughts on that question, if you have any. Thank you.
Thomas Merton had a profound desire to achieve a spiritual unity between his Catholic faith and other world religions, first existentially in his own person, and then perhaps spreading it abroad into the corporate consciousness of the Church. Despite inspiring many academic and monastic conferences of dialogue, Merton has had limited success in changing the mainstream Catholic culture. He remains a polarizing figure in the Church. The U.S. bishops decided in 2005 to delete his name off the list of influential figures from the opening chapter of the American Catholic Catechism, citing a concern with his searching across religious boundaries toward the end of his life. For most Catholics outside of academia, he has yet to emerge as a familiar icon of a broader, more universal Catholic spirit. It is my contention that though Merton achieved a fruitful personal synthesis with other religious currents, a firm sedimentation of his experience into the collective ecclesial imagination has not happened due to some paradoxical aspects of that synthesis. The paradox is this: Merton's creative intuition, which enabled him to empathetically assimilate to other cultures, is limited in bucking the trend of modern/postmodern disintegration and may end up reinforcing an individualist spirituality unable to influence the mainstream culture. I began by discussing Merton's intuition, which according to many scholars was his greatest gift. The intuitive empathy and creative process underpinning Merton's career find an excellent explanation in his friend Jacques Maritain's two books, Art and Scholasticism and Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. Art and Scholasticism is a metaphysical affirmation of human subjectivity. It provides a reconciliation between a traditional Catholic metaphysic and the artistic freedom of modern subjects. It does so by showing the intimate analogy between art and contemplation. The spirituality of art, according to Maritain, is the most natural bridge to the joy of supernatural contemplation. In the other book, Maritain offers a philosophy of creative intuition as the secret inspiration behind all works of art and poetry. Creative intuition dwells in the deepest part of the soul, what Maritain calls the pre-conscious life of the intellect, and feeds from the immediately apprehended data supplied by the senses. It is awakened when the artist, fully attuned to the totality of life in his or her subjectivity, catches a flash of concrete reality in the world of things and absorbs it through an intentional emotion. Maritain's philosophy helps explain several aspects of Merton's life. It underpins the central conflict of his life, namely his dual identities as a contemplative monk and an outrageously productive writer. His inability to stop writing while a monastic belies an implicit conviction that his writings are spiritual works of art. As such, the creation is for him a fertile passage for asymptotically approaching contemplative union. Once created, they become the embodiment of a profound moment of spirituality. Furthermore, Merton's ability to empathetically connect with others can be understood through Maritain's notion of connatural knowledge. This is a knowledge by intuition, inclination, or sympathy, through which artists and poets become connaturalized with the mystery that is scattered in the world. Merton had an exceptional capacity for connatural knowledge by which he contemplated and communed with those who are wildly different from him. Let me give some examples. The famous account of Merton's aesthetic illumination in 1968 in front of the Buddha statues of Sri Lanka is most striking. In this experience, the aesthetic and the religious converge together in a deeply illuminating moment. Merton writes of this moment, I quote, the rock, all matter, all life is charged with Dharmakaya. Everything is emptiness and everything is compassion. I don't know when in my life I have ever had such a sense of beauty and spiritual validity running together in one aesthetic illumination. I know and have seen what I was obscurely looking for. I don't know what else remains, but I have now seen and have pierced through the surface, and have got beyond the shadow and the disguise. The whole thing is very much a Zen garden, a span of barrenness and openness and evidence, and the gray figures, motionless, yet with the lines in full movement, waves of vesture and bodily form, a beautiful and holy vision. What Merton describes here, end quote. What Merton describes here is akin to a profound religious experience one might have in front of a Madonna and Child statue, or like Paul Claudel's life-altering experience listening to a choir singing Vespers in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It was not a conversion per se for Merton, but it was an experience just as penetrating. For a moment, he saw the Buddha nature of existence, catching a glimpse of the emptiness and interconnectedness of all being. Merton's translation of Zhuangzi is another example. Relying on existing translations rather than the Chinese original, Merton produced an innovative recreation of Zhuangzi instead of a conventional translation. John Wu thought that if Zhuangzi had known English, he would have written exactly the same way as Merton did.
Thank you.
Sorry. In comparison, Wu thought James Lake's translation too academic, and Herbert Giles' rather glib, whereas Merton was the true man of the Tao, uttering fresh insights in beautiful verse. High praise indeed. In chapter 6 of Zhuangzi, there is a story of 3 friends, one of whom dies. Confucius sends a disciple to help with the funeral proceedings. Upon arriving, the disciple finds the 2 friends making merry with music and celebrating. And this is what they were singing in Merton's translation. You have gone where you really were, and we are here. Damn it, we are here. The disciple burst in and exclaimed, May I inquire where you found this in the rubrics for obsequies, this frivolous caroling in the presence of the departed? The 2 friends looked at each other and laughed. Poor fellow, they said, he doesn't know the new liturgy. Several phrases here do not appear at all in the original. Damn it, the rubrics for obsequies, frivolous, poor fellow, and new liturgy. The original punchline is instead, he doesn't know the true meaning of li, which is ritual propriety. Employing such interpolations and manipulation of words as Merton did would have earned him a poor grade in a translation class. But both Wu and Lucien Miller believed that this creative license brought him closer to the spirit of Zhuangzi, who likes to lampoon Confucius' clinging to empty form. Transposing the modern Catholic squabble on liturgy onto the ancient debate between Zhuangzi and Confucius on ritual propriety turns out to be a stroke of rhetorical genius. So it was that through creative intuition, Merton interacted with other religions with the freedom of spirit. His intuitive style became a powerful countervoice to the pre-Vatican II Catholic theology. The question is, are there limitations to this style? Ideas and experiences depend on a fertile context to become live options for the public. The experience of one man, no matter how profound, is not enough. Merton is influential to the extent to which his story, insights, and spirit become an attractive part of the Catholic imagination. Could his name one day be instinctively associated among the faithful with an inspiring Catholic openness to other religions? Such a prospect remains futuristic. Not only is it difficult to find Merton a stable home in the Catholic imagination, it is increasingly difficult to even speak of such an imagination. As Christopher Pramack woefully notes in 2002, by the time today's young adults reach college, what often faces them is not only a crisis in Catholic identity, but more disturbingly, a crisis of meaning. That is to say, today's Catholic imagination is more fractured than before. Charles Taylor describes a nova effect with a galloping pluralism on the spiritual plane in the 20th century, culminating in the 1960s. He calls this period the age of authenticity. Merton himself was a product of this age, which had its origin in the Romantic movement and was marked by an expressivist individualism.
Its highest values are unity, integrity, holism, individuality, with a practical focus on the spiritual experience of the individual. Herein lies the paradox for Merton. Longing for a wholesome spiritual integration in all dimensions, his best available path leads him to a romantic expressivism haunted by an individualism. However much he desired a wholesome and integral society, the need for personal authenticity comes first. To find and cultivate his true self against all forces of distraction was the paramount task. Borrowing language from the Chinese tradition, I will say that though he desired to live in a Confucian society of beauty and harmony, Merton was compelled by circumstance and by temperament to be a full-fledged Taoist. The trouble is, the freedom and authenticity of Taoism and likewise of Zen Buddhism are not most conducive to communal cultural integration. As William Theodore de Berry and Li Zeho point out from Chinese history, it has usually been the Confucian element which was capacious and adaptive enough to assimilate the spiritual insights of other currents, such as Taoism and Buddhism. Historically speaking, Taoism and Buddhism paled beside Confucianism in inclusivity, in outward orientation, and in the ability to influence the social imaginary. Taoist and Buddhist values become a stable part of culture only after being incorporated into the philosophical, moral, aesthetic, and ritual context of Confucianism, or what Li calls its humanistic matrix. A similar limitation haunts Merton's brand of expressivism. In the first place, Merton's approach to interreligious dialogue leaves a gap between experience and the larger body of religious tradition. John Keenan and de Berry both note that in his engagement with the Asian religions, Merton overwhelmingly focused on the aspect of contemplative experience while paying little attention to their historical, doctrinal, ritual, and social characteristics. This lacuna could create a romanticized or Orientalist image of Asian religions and leading eventually to disillusion. Those attracted to Merton's experiential witness and yet without a firm grounding in a religious discipline may end up with a facile, individualist spirituality with little to contribute to authentic dialogue. Moreover, Merton's abrupt death at the Bangkok conference has prevented a satisfying conclusion to his story, at least from the perspective of an observer. His opus operandi was openness to the unknown and unexpected, and the ending was very much the same, unknown and unexpected. A true Taoist, he remained a wanderer to the end. On the pages of his Asian journal, he was still wondering out loud about where his next monastic residence was going to be. This ambiguity would not matter much to a Taoist or Zen monk, but it would to Catholics envisioning a future of global Catholicism. At the center of this ambiguity lies a tension between the ordinary texture of Catholic life and Merton's desire for that element of the extraordinary. This tension kept him restless to the end, contributing to the gap between his personal experience and the larger Catholic tradition. Another weakness pertains to the aesthetic fragility of modern poetry and art, the very language Merton speaks. As art and poetry take on the characteristics of modern/postmodern milieu, the subjective side tends to dominate the objective, resulting in more abstract forms of expression and a more elusive grasp of meaning. As Taylor remarks, I quote, "Modern poetry doesn't rely on already recognized structures. It opens new paths, sets free new realities, but only for those for whom it resonates." End quote. The more creative and artistic Merton's language, the more likely his audience will be limited to a group already sharing his literary and aesthetic inclinations. At this point, I will hope to revisit Maritain, who shows a great admiration for Chinese art in creative intuition, so much so that he associates the habitus of the perfect artist with the supreme category of excellence in Chinese aesthetics, which is yi, or effortlessness. Unsurprisingly, this value is a Taoist aesthetic, indebted to Zhuangzi. On the other hand, Maritain critiques Chinese art for what he perceives to be a boring tradition of symbolism. I quote, "Those bamboos, invariably stern in their never-yielding flexibility. Those plum trees, invariably courageous because they blossom in winter. Those orchids, invariably pure because they display their beauty in solitude, etc." End quote. What he suggests here is that these conventional symbols of meaning become impediment to the artist's freedom of spirit and expression. Maritain probably did not know that these symbols are only one part of a historically shaped tradition of meaningful images and metaphors. Moreover, their meaning associations would not necessarily hamper creativity, as those familiar with Chinese poetry can attest. At the hands of gifted poets and painters, natural symbols, natural objects with their familiar evocations can convey a wide range of emotional subtlety. Most important, Maritain misses a guiding Confucian spirit of Chinese art. Unlike modern Western art, which aims to illuminate the ontological secret of the object's inmost being, Chinese art serves to conjure up imaginary reality, an entire world of meaning and emotion permeated by the sense of harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. It embodies the correspondence and resonance between the cosmos and human society. As such, it has been able to reflect in its expression the cultural evolutions of society. Images and meanings of the orchid, the plum tree, and the bamboo become stable elements of continuity, not because of mere convention, but because they have been lodged into the collective unconscious by the historical sedimentation of previous generations. They are part of a shared aesthetic language and holistic context capable of absorbing newer expressions into a vital and stable social imaginary. Unfortunately, such a shared language and context are more and more elusive in the West. On Merton's part, he shares a similar distaste with Maritain for the cultural conventions of Confucianism. Many of the historical institutional aspects of Confucianism appear to Merton as decadent incrustations and corrupt deviations from its original integrity, causing him to exclude this tradition from the so-called higher religions. As de Berry demonstrates, in this judgment, Merton shows himself wanting in historical knowledge of the vital and creative capacity of Confucianism, unable to fully appreciate the Confucian influence in the dignity of everyday life, educational reform, and the cultural revitalization of not only China, but also other East Asian countries. The root reason for this prejudice, remarks de Berry, is because Merton is more poet than historian. And I would add that Merton was fated to be more of a Taoist than a Confucian. Yet unlike traditional Taoists, he was an individualist expressivist whose linguistic matrix suffers from a diminishing cultural consensus. As a result, his vision for dialogue remains to be incorporated into the mainstream Catholic culture. What remains to be done is to close the gap between Merton's legacy and the Catholic imagination. The goal to eventually transform what were in Merton's experience elements of the extraordinary into the ordinary fabric of Catholic life. Toward that effort, it will help to somehow bring the Taoist Merton truly down to earth in a Confucian sense. Or using Peter Phan's language, meaningful connections should be explored between Merton's insights and the deep structures of Catholicism through the multiple channels of doctrines, rituals, institution, art, and behaviors.
Thank you, Dr. Lindblum, for your beautiful comparison of the poetic version of the Bible and the English version of the Bible. So my question for you is, which part of traditional Chinese culture that is opposite to the Western teaching but attracted you most?
What John Woo did that I also find fascinating, but he wrote a book called The Golden Age of Zen, which some of you may have read. He explains the early history of Zen Buddhism. I learned so much from that book that I knew almost nothing about Zen Buddhism before that, and I learned a great deal from him from that book. And then when I saw some of the Buddhist terms that he uses in here, I find that to be really fascinating, because I think historically missionaries have found something in Taoism and in Confucianism that they could find to be similar to Christianity, and then have kind of built upon that, right? If I'm not mistaken, the Jesuits, they kind of embraced Confucianism and maybe kind of found some positive things in Taoism, but they more or less had a negative view of Buddhism. But John Woo embraced Buddhism. One of the 4 character phrases that I didn't put into this presentation, but it's also in the first chapter of John's Gospel, is Chao fan ru sheng, to transcend the ordinary and become a being of a higher order. And thanks to my advisor, Rob Gemello, for giving me that translation. So in John's Gospel, where it says, those who received him, meaning the Logos, Jesus, he gave the power to become children of God. John Wu uses that Buddhist phrase, Chao fan ru sheng. And that's one element that I find really fascinating. Because the Chinese readers would know that that's a Buddhist idea. But John Wu is making it into a Christian idea. And he does that many, many times in this translation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Zhixi Wang. I'm from northeast China. I'm a diocesan priest. From your presentation, we know Zhang Wu, he read the Chinese traditional culture like the Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and lead him to the Catholicism. But from now on, in China, some people, they from their little age, they learn the Chinese traditional culture. I want to question for you. You mean for now, from the Chinese traditional culture, it's easy to lead the Catholicism or not? I want to hear from your, respect.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think there are different approaches to the relationship between Catholicism and Chinese cultures or Chinese religious traditions. I think for now, what we call the guoxue, the national learning, the state pushes the children to learn those guoxue. I think, it's hard to say whether it's more easier. It's easier for Chinese children now to convert to Catholicism through learning those guoxue. I think, that depends on how you approach it, right? So John C.H. Wu is only one example who tried to argue that Chinese culture and Catholicism are inclusive, not exclusive to each other. But I think what the Chinese state wants to do is to impose a dichotomy between the East and West, between Chinese national learning, Confucianism, for example, and Western tradition. So the state is trying to, I think, dissuade Chinese children from identifying more with the Western tradition. So probably it's even harder for those Chinese children to accept Catholicism due to the probably what we call indoctrination from the state. So I don't know whether that answers the question. Probably other panelists could also answer that first.
This is for Kathy. Did you say that William de Barry wrote about Merton? Could you provide the source? Did Merton miss the correspondence implied? in the four gentlemen, bamboo, orchid, of nature to human beings, or what nature counsels individuals on upright character? And aside, you know that DeBerry converted to Catholicism. Any response?
DeBerry wrote an article, I think it was titled Thomas Merton and Confucianism, or something very similar to that. It was a minor critique of Merton's slide of Confucianism. And Merton himself does not talk about these four symbols, but his intellectual style is very close to Maritain. He believes that Maritain was the greatest Catholic philosopher of the 20th century. So these two books, and when he was in the monastery, even in the 1960s, he was using Maritain's book to teach the novices. That just shows you to the extent to which the two of them are very much in common, have a lot in common. So Maritain was the one that talks about the boring symbolism of these four natural objects.
I also have a question for Dr. Lindblum. So first of all, thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. So I just have a clarificatory question. So how far did John Woo get in his translation of the New Testament or the Bible? I mean, how much of the Bible did he translate? And how widely used is his translation in today's church?
He translated the entire New Testament, all the way from the Gospels to Revelation, and the entire book of Psalms. And so that's how much he did, which is an incredible accomplishment for one person to do that much. And it took him almost 10 years to do the whole thing, probably closer to 8 years. Started in around 1940, maybe 1942. So maybe 7 years. The Psalms was published in 1946 in Shanghai. And then the dream that Wu and his spiritual director, Nicholas Mestrini, PIME missionary, they had the dream to publish the New Testament also in Shanghai. But it wasn't done until like early 1949, late 1948. So the Communist Party already had either taken over or almost taken over the publishing industry in Shanghai, so they couldn't publish it in the mainland. So it was published by a Catholic publisher in Hong Kong in 1949. And it was by that time it was published as a Catholic translation. It even had a letter from the Pope, a letter of endorsement from the Pope at the beginning, and a letter from the Chinese Archbishop Yubin at the beginning. So it didn't start out with Chiang Kai-shek as being intended to be a Catholic translation, but by the end it was. And so about how it's used today, that's also a question I have. It's not, to my knowledge, it's not widely used in China today because one aspect I didn't get to talk about much is that it was done into this classical style, which requires a high level of education and is difficult to read for people today. And so it's not widely used today. At the time it was published, though, it was a huge event. It was a highly celebrated event for Catholics in China at the time it was published. And another famous Chinese Catholic, Lu Zhengqiang, wanted it to become the official Chinese Catholic version of the Bible, but the church did not make it the official version because it departs too much from the original languages of the Bible. So eventually in 1968 the Sigao version was published and it became the official version. So that's what's widely used today. So I think today it's more so used for people who want something that's got this cultural flavor and this beauty that John Woo contains in it. One fascinating thing is that there's a Russian Orthodox church in Hong Kong, and they wanted to put together some liturgical books with psalms in them. And so they started asking around their Chinese church members, what's the most beautiful version of the Beatitudes and some of the psalms. And so they came up with John Woo's version. So they've printed John Woo's version in one of their liturgical books. And then Hu Mingjie has made these videos, these songs. I'm not aware of any other public uses of John Woo's Bible today, but I would like to know if there are. And I would like to see the New Testament republished today, but I don't know how that's going to happen. But I'm thinking of ways. If you have ideas, let me know.
This is fascinating. You may have mentioned this, but maybe I missed it. So from which version of, the Greek text did he translate the Bible from?
That's another big question. He did not translate from the Hebrew and Greek. He mostly translated from the English and French. And he consulted commentaries, sometimes Latin, sometimes he looked up some Greek and Hebrew words. But when he was asked about this, he said, we have so many good commentaries on the Bible in so many languages that we don't, in order to make a good Chinese translation, I need to know Chinese. I don't have to know Greek and Hebrew. Now, Bible translators, you could argue with that, and I did a whole part of my dissertation on the theories of Bible translation, and there's a whole huge literature about whether Bible translation should be as close as possible to the original Greek and Hebrew, or whether you should aim for making it as dynamic and attractive in the target language, in this case Chinese. So John Woo obviously was toward the end of making it the most appealing in Chinese, and he departs pretty significantly from the Greek and Hebrew in some parts of it, especially in the Psalms. He's not trying to do the Psalms word by word at all. He's just trying to capture the ideas and then make them into good Chinese poetry. With the New Testament, he stays closer to the original text, but then when he borrows, like Chengyu, he borrows sometimes incorporating words that are nowhere found in the original text. One example is 群虚若雾, which in Chinese is to scrabble about like mad ducks. And he uses that in John after the feeding of the 5,000 when the crowds are going after Jesus. So John Woo says the crowds follow Jesus like a crowd of mad ducks. But there's nothing about ducks in the Greek.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there's just so many fun, fascinating examples like that.
So Katharina Wenzel-Tuber was asking about the reception of John Woo in mainland China today, especially within the church. You've said a bit about the sort of modern day non-usage of the Bible. But what about John Woo as a figure? Is he discussed in the context of Sinicization? Perhaps any of you can answer that.
We heard earlier today in the panel that Sinicization, as it's discussed in mainland China, is mainly used in a political sense. So in the political sense of Sinicization, it means accepting the party, and John Woo is not discussed at all in that sense, because John Woo was closely associated with Chiang Kai-shek, and so I think the Chinese government today wants people to would not want attention on John Woo, but John Woo has attracted a lot of attention for his role in the history of law. That's a whole different dimension of his career, but he drafted the Constitution, and legal scholars in mainland China are interested in him, among other things. But if we mean enculturation, and what the church means by enculturation, which we've heard a little bit about today also, then John Woo is very much an important figure for the reasons that Wang Zhishi mentioned. Bringing what is best in that culture and bringing it into the church, and also allowing the church to renew it and transform it. And that could be another topic for a great debate and argument too.
Thank you, everyone.